Okay, everybody, welcome to the last module of the course, Module 9. We're going to talk about a few different areas of economics here, feminist, evolutionary, and pluralist economics. Let me turn the slide on so that you can see that, and this is where we're going here. Pluralist economics is just kind of a grab bag of combining all of the different theories of economics in order to analyze the economy in a more meaningful way, perhaps. But feminist and evolutionary economics are very important fields of study, neither of which really can be depicted in their fullness in a survey course like this, but we'll do our best job to give you an idea of the types of issues these really innovative fields of economics tend to look at. Let's start with feminist economics, right? One of the main questions that's at the root of this discipline of feminist economics is, do men and women naturally have different personalities? This is kind of fundamental for economics, so you kind of have to start here if you're going to look at gender differences in the economy. Why? Well, if you think of it, economics, if you go with that classic definition of what economics is, it's a science of choice. How do people make choices based on their own preferences, their utility functions at the margin, that sort of thing? Well, your preferences are an expression of who you are. So fundamentally, before you can do a feminist analysis or a gender analysis of economics, you have to understand if men and women are actually functionally different naturally, economically. So this is an important question to address. To do that, you kind of have to go into sociological understandings of sex versus gender. Roughly, sex is used as the term to represent biological differences between men and women. There's all sorts of debates about where to put that dividing line between men and women, if there are only two genders, and that sort of thing. We're going to leave those to the side here. There's also debates on whether you should be dividing analytically sex from gender. We're going to leave that for the side here. It's very interesting, and I encourage anybody to read up on that stuff and study that because it is important economically. However, in the basic fundamental simplified way, we're going to discuss the sociological categories of sex and gender. Sex is biological. Gender is based on learned social roles. That's institutions, right? Our learned social roles, our cultures, that falls under the category economically as of institutions. Okay, so gender is based on institutions like culture, especially, and different institutions, the law and whatnot. Sex is based on biology. So we have to understand how much of human behavior, human economic behavior, human preferences, how much of that is based on biology and how much is that based on culture and other institutions? Well, it's tough to know how to get there, and there's all sorts of research in this area, and we're going to go with some rough and ready, what economists call stylized facts. It's our best guesses based on all of the research that's out there. So in psychology, they talk a lot about the 5 big personality traits that exist in humans. These are the personality traits that you can mix in various ways, and they produce kind of all that you are at your very basic level. And given, if you look at most of the research, again, there's issues here that suggest, well, trying to look at sort of nature versus nurture arguments don't really apply very well anyway, and we should take that as truth. It's really hard to make a clean nature versus nurture argument. Nature and nurture are actually combined in very interesting ways. But if we are to make that real false binary between what is biological and what is cultural and social, we can make a rough and ready rule based on the literature that's out there that maybe half of what we are is based on nature. We inherit it in our biology, in our genes, and half of what we are we learn culturally. That's really rough and ready, and there's a lot of nuance to that any sociologist or psychologist will tell you a lot about if they give you the time. But we'll roll ahead with that because it's a good stylized fact to use for this economics discussion. Okay, so here are the big 5 personality traits for each human. And again, the idea is you can mix these traits and produce behaviors, right? And predict types of behaviors. These are what make us who we are, essentially. They are extroversion. How extroverted are you? How agreeable are you? How conscientious are you? How emotionally stable are you? And how open are you to new experience? And these pictures here are just, these look like a lot of measures that you would get amongst university students for your levels in all of these big 5 traits. This is a sample from university students in Italy from this study that I've got linked down here. And they're divided here, what's important, according to gender. How do men and women map as far as extroversion? That's our first area that we're looking at here. Well, as you can see, your first impression in looking at this graph, red here is women, blue is men, and you say, well, those are like really close together, those lines. It looks like men and women are kind of the same as far as extroversion here. On the bottom axis, that's just how high the score is. It was a scale of 1 to 7. And then this is the density, how many people essentially chose that score. So, men tended to have, if you would look at the top of this, you'll find the median score. So roughly on average, you can see that the average for men was around 4 and the average for women was around 4 in this extroversion scale. You do notice, though, that men do seem slightly more extroverted than women. Is that an important amount? Does that make a lot of difference? Well, just looking at this scale, you would probably, if you're using a statistical analytical mind, you would look at, okay, well, let's say the average, that woman that's right in the middle, she's around ranked 4. Well, there's going to be a lot of men, almost half of the men are less extroverted than that woman. So you can't really clearly say that men are more extroverted than women really in any meaningful statistical way here, especially when you consider that half of this result, it could be assumed, about half of it could be assumed to be related to culture, institutions, socialization, and not natural at all. So what I would suggest is if you look at a picture like this, where the lines are so close together, and you know that half of this result is driven, at least 50% of it, by just social and cultural expectations, it's pretty easy to make the decision that, well, there's not a biological difference between men and women on who is more extroverted. Men and women are about equally extroverted, it looks like. Let's look at the next one, agreeableness. And you can see that women tend to be a little more agreeable than men. But again, it's really tight. These lines are really tight together. And if half of this difference, only around half of this difference is because of genetic, biological differences between men and women, you could very much expect these really, in reality, biologically, men and women are approximately just as agreeable as each other's. No real difference between men and women in agreeableness. Again, you can look at conscientiousness. Yes, women seem to be more conscientious, but again, those lines are tight together. There's likely not very much, if any, statistically significant difference biologically between men and women on which are more conscientious. If there is a difference between men and women on conscientiousness, it's likely mostly coming from culture and socialization would be something you'd expect here. You might find a small difference, and some studies have small difference in conscientiousness levels between men and women, but it's really tiny, and you shouldn't amplify the importance of that because look, essentially you can see it, I can see it, these lines are pretty tight together. Emotional stability is the one in which the lines are most far apart. Women seem to rank less in emotional stability, although in other studies that I don't have here, that difference appears only in certain countries and not in other countries. So there's a really strong indication that this is a cultural difference or an institutional difference. That one there, so it's likely, and studies have found that this difference does disappear if you choose a different culture, a different country, and a different type of culture. There is a chance that there is more natural difference between men and women in emotional stability, although if you look at the graph, they still go kind of in the same direction, well, exactly in the same direction. They move together quite closely. There's not a lot of difference between men and women as far as emotional stability is concerned. And then finally, the last of the big 5 personality traits, openness to experience. Well, even without taking culture or nature or nurture into account, you can see that they're mapped really perfectly on top of one another. There's no difference between men and women. So taken together, really, we can suggest that there's very little natural biological difference in average personalities between men and women by looking at data like this. And there's many more studies, of course. This is just an example. Biologically, then, men and women are about the same regarding their personalities. That means they're about the same regarding their likes, dislikes, preferences, for kinds of work and things like that. So what does that leave? Really, the differences in male and female economic behavior are likely based in gender and institutions. That is, they're not biological, they're social and cultural somehow. So that's a really important understanding to have before you move and discuss anything as far as gender analysis in economic behavior. So we can go from that and we can look at this Homo economicus thing and we can understand how in Western culture, or what we can call weird culture, and we're going to do that, Homo economicus is actually a man, written by men, designed by men, and written to exhibit culturally defined male traits, not biological male traits, because men and women are pretty much the same biologically. Culturally defined male traits, that's what Homo economicus is. So let's take a look at this. Gender roles. That's how we learn culturally to behave if we're told we're a man or a woman in a society. In weird societies, gender roles in weird societies have been divided culturally between men and women. So what men are expected to do compared to what women are expected to do. I keep saying weird societies here. So what do I mean? That's an acronym used often in social research, meaning Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic, right? Western society, more or less. So weird societies are those that are Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. Weird societies have tended to have, especially since for the last couple hundred years, very strictly enforced culturally gender roles. Before that, these gender roles weren't enforced so strictly. There wasn't such clear roles of men and women strictly defined. And of course, if you go back to hunting and gathering societies, men and women's roles were not that clearly defined. But something happened really around 200, 300 years ago that really amplified these very strict gender roles between men and women in these weird societies. So how were men written compared to women is a very important question economically because it shows that social institutions create our economic behavior and it genders them. So men are socialized in Western societies since around the time of the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations text in 1776. Men have been socialized to be more like Homo economicus. And things that don't act like Homo economicus, they have tended to be marginalized in our society. So what does marginalized mean? It really means ignored, diminished, undervalued, and pushed to the side. So let's think of this. Men are socialized to be Homo economicus, and things that don't act like Homo economicus, because neoclassical economics really became hegemonic, things that don't act like Homo economicus get pushed to the side and undervalued. Okay, so let's remind ourselves what these things that act like Homo economicus act like. What are men socialized in weird societies to act like? They're supposed to be autonomous, self-reliant, calculating, that's Homo economicus, right? Asocial, they're less social. They don't have social bonds as much. They're not emotional, that is, they're rational, not emotional. They're self-interested, and they work for money. That's why they work. So this is Homo economicus, but it's also how we've written men and conceptualized men to be in our society. How have we conceptualized women in weird societies? Connected, more social, more caring, again, more social, more emotional, more altruistic. They'll do things for others. And they're more likely to work for love instead of just to work for money. This is how women are typically depicted in weird societies. Now, to remind you, men and women are genetically not that different, right? But culturally, we have written men as Homo economicus here and women as this connected, caring, social, emotional, altruistic thing that works for love instead of money, doesn't need money to motivate it, right? So one is Homo economicus. The other, I think just today, I've called Homo feminomicus, which is hard to say, and maybe that's why people haven't been using that, but we'll use Homo feminomicus. Maybe I'll put it in an exam or something like that because it's fun, and I just made it up today. Okay, so Homo feminomicus is connected, caring, social, emotional, altruistic, and works for love. Homo economicus is autonomous, calculating, asocial, non-emotional, self-interested, and works for pay. Homo economicus is a man. The basic model of neoclassical economic thinking, and many of the schools of thought that followed, like Keynesian economics, for example, that basic fundamental building block of economic theory is a man and socialized as such. It's not natural. It's made that way by an institution, by culture. This actually matters a lot, and let's look at some reasons why it might matter. First, GDP, the way we calculate national accounts. I'm using GDP. I could be using GNI or GNP or whatever here. National accounting, like GDP, it's biased to count more work that men do, and it ignores the work that women do. It doesn't value women's work. There's that word marginalizes the work of women. Doesn't think it matters. Doesn't even count the work of women. Let's use some examples. But first we have to understand what we mean by work. And there are actually two different theories we're going to discuss here. Neoclassical economics uses disutility theory. Disutility theory. So utility is the joy and happiness that you get out of a thing, or the use you get out of a thing. Disutility is its opposite. Neoclassical disutility theory says work is something you don't like to do that you have to be compelled to do for money. That's what work is, right? So it doesn't matter what you do, how valuable it is. If you like it, it's not work. Okay. If you don't like it, it's work. And that's how neoclassical economics defines work with disutility theory. Feminist economics is different. It says work is any work that you do, whether you do it for free or not, whether you like it or not. It's just any work you do. You could do it out of love, obligation, guilt, duty, passion, whatever it is. But if you do something, it's work. Okay, that's feminist economic theory. Here's an example. What is the value economically of doing the dishes? According to neoclassical disutility theory, the economic value of doing the dishes is nothing. It is something that you do for free in your house, so there is no value economically to doing the dishes. Feminist theory would say something different. It says, if you want to establish what the value of that job was, and maybe this couple are fighting right now over the value of how they should value within the household doing the dishes. That's how I imagine it anyway. Feminist economics theory says that act of doing the dishes is worth however much you would have to pay somebody to do it for you. If that woman's saying, you know what, I do this every day. I'm sorry I'm making you do the dishes, but this is actually valuable work and you don't recognize me for it. How valuable it is? I don't know. Why don't you go hire somebody to do the dishes every day and then you'll find out how valuable it is. So presumably that guy would have to pay a few $100s a week for somebody to come over and do the dishes. That's how valuable doing the dishes is. But you notice this, doing the dishes, a valuable activity, is not registered in gross domestic product. It's not registered as valuable in economic accounting. It's not even registered as work. That's a main argument of feminist economics, that much of the work that women do just isn't counted. The argument rests on the assumption that women do more unpaid work than men do. Well, let's see if that's true. Well, I told you with the title of this slide, I guess, yeah, women do more unpaid work on average than men. Let's look at this across a sample of the OECD countries. And again, when I talk about OECD countries, you're talking about the rich countries of the world, right? So here we have Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom, United States, and Sweden, which isn't officially an OECD country for some reason, but it's in here too, because it's an interesting example in this case. So let's look at these data. First, we can really look at Canada, the United States here, right, and Canada over here. They're nearly identical. The green part, let's look at this. Men, here's men. The blue part is how many hours a day they spend on paid work. The green part is how many hours a day men spend on unpaid work. And you can see, yes, in the United States, men spend a tiny bit less on unpaid work than Canada, but those two countries are pretty similar. Okay, so I'm going to do Canada here to start because it's easy to see because it's the first one listed. You can clearly see the blue part of these bars. Men do more unpaid work, more paid work, than women do. Men do about 4.5 hours on average. This is the average man, 4.5 hours a day of paid work. Women do about 3.5 hours a day of paid work. But if you look at the total amount of work that men and women do in Canada in this case, you see that women work about 7.5 hours a day on average, while men only work 7 hours a day on average. The difference here is that most of women's work is unpaid. They don't get paid for it. And here's that unpaid portion, the green. You can see this green part of the bar is unpaid work done by women. Yes, women do much more unpaid work than men in Canada. And again, I can go over to the United States and you can see the same thing happening in the United States. So in both those countries, women do more work than men. in total, and they do much more unpaid work. If you go to France, yes, the same relationship exists. People tend to, I see, work less in France in total, men or women, but women work more, and it's much more unpaid work compared to men. We go to Germany, same thing. Women work more than men, but most of it is unpaid work. For women, the paid work, men get paid, do more paid work than men. Italy, men do more paid work than women. Sorry. Italy, same thing. Women work more than men. It's even amplified more. Women don't do much paid work at all in Italy comparatively, but do a lot more unpaid work. Japan, same thing. Women work more than men, and most of it is unpaid. The United Kingdom, women work more than men. It's mostly unpaid. United States, we've already discussed. It's the same as Canada. Sweden, this is where something gets interesting. Women in Sweden actually work less than men. And the amount of unpaid work, yes, women do a little bit more unpaid work as a proportion than men, but it's not nearly as pronounced a difference as it is in these other countries. Look at the United States right beside it. Women do a lot more unpaid work in the United States compared to men, but in Sweden it's pretty close, pretty equal. So it makes you want to ask, or it makes me want to ask, what's up with Sweden, right? Well, this is what Sweden does. In Sweden, the state pays half of every housework bill up to around 5,000 American dollar value. Half. So if you hire that person to come and do your dishes, the government pays half of it. It subsidizes it. What does that mean? Women are more, and men, families are more likely to hire out people to do housework so that women can go and do more paid work, go and work in the office or as cleaners as well. And men can also, of course, work as cleaners, doing housework and odd jobs and things like that. What does that mean? It actually takes a lot of the unpaid work and uncounted work that is not counted in GDP, and it makes it counted in GDP, because as soon as you pay somebody to do that work, all of a sudden it's counted, right? So that's an interesting policy that they have in Sweden that makes unpaid work, what we might call care work, unpaid work anyway, it makes it less done by women proportionally, and it also starts to include it in gross domestic product. So the big question from this comes up a lot in feminist economics. Is our national accounting just wonky? Why don't we count a huge amount of the work done by humans? If you look at this graph, sorry, I banged the microphone there. If you look at this graph, it looks like about half of the work of the human species is not counted in GDP. That means half of the economically valuable work we do just isn't counted. So feminist economists ask, should unpaid work be included in national accounting, be included in GDP? That's a huge part of feminist economics, and I think this would count as the other huge part. It's related in economics. Discussions of the gender pay gap. What is that? Well, here it is. Again, in OECD countries, actually these are more than the OECD countries, but they're the wealthier countries of the world, mostly listed here. The OECD average is about 13.6. What does that mean? Women get paid 13.6% less than men on average. That's the OECD country average. It really varies by country. Luxembourg and Belgium are only around 3.5%. The difference between men and women, that's not much of a difference, right? So right there, you can understand that it is very much culturally and institutionally related. If it were biologically related for some reason that women got paid less than men, well, these numbers would be the same in every country, wouldn't they? But they're very different. Luxembourg and Belgium have very low gender pay gaps. That is, women get paid almost as much as men, only about 3.5% less than men. But if you go to, say, here's Japan, right? Women get paid almost 25% less than men. So there's a lot of literature about why this could happen. And some just say, hey, women, neoclassical theory would suggest women just prefer low-paying jobs or prefer not to work on their careers as much and things like that, so they get paid less. That can't be a biological argument, of course, because the gender pay gap persists across different cultures, but at different levels. Some cultures like Luxembourg and Belgium have hardly any gender pay gap, but you go to Israel, Japan, Estonia, Korea, there's huge gender pay gaps. I mean, Korea, the gender pay gap is almost 35%. So there's something there to be studied. There's something there that clearly matters. The argument, a very common argument, as I mentioned, is that, well, maybe women just choose less lucrative careers because they are genetically predisposed or maybe culturally predisposed for this unpaid care type work. Perhaps. But if you look at within the high-paying careers, you'll see that throughout, all the way down the board, women get paid less than men. Here's an example here in Figure 1. These are the median annual earnings by sex in selected fields when people have degrees in these fields. Okay, so men and women on average with degrees in electrical engineering, the women get paid about, well, $20,000 a year less than men on average. So electrical engineers, if you're a woman, you get paid less than men. Same in computer science. Female computer scientists get paid, well, again, that's $25,000 less than male computer scientists, even with the same degrees, right? Mechanical engineering, women get paid less than men. Female economists get paid less than male economists. Family and consumer services, women get paid less. Elementary and even elementary education, women get paid less than men. In the fine arts, women get paid less than men. And in social work, women get paid less than men. These are fields with associated degrees that both the men and women have, and training that both the women have, but consistently, women get paid less than men. Okay, so let's go over this, some more detail in the gender pay gap to try and figure out why a little bit more. It does seem that women choose in the market less lucrative careers. That's very interesting, and that's what this this graph suggests, right? So only 13% of petroleum engineers, a very lucrative career, only 13% of those are women. Why? Pharmacy, actually 52% are women. So more women slightly than men go into pharmacy, and that's a lucrative career. Mathematics and computer science, only 33% of women go into those careers. Aerospace engineering, only 12%. Chemical engineering, 28%. Electrical engineering, only 11% of electrical engineers are women. Naval architecture, marine engineering, only 3%. Metallurgy, etc., etc. These engineering fields, mostly here, women don't tend to enroll in them in any great numbers compared to men. Let's look at the least lucrative careers, like drama and theater arts. 60% of drama and theater artists are women. Studio arts, 66%. Communication disorder sciences, 94%. Visual and performing arts, 77%. Health, medical prep programs, 55%. Social work, interesting, 88% of social workers are women. Theological stuff, human services and community organization, 81% are women. Early childhood education, 97% are women, and counseling and psychology, 74% are women, and these tend to be less lucrative careers. So some explain, neoclassical theory would suggest, well, women naturally are carers, and they like they like to care for their communities, so they choose these careers. Okay, so let's define care work a little bit more carefully here and look at that idea, because I said that phrase care work quite a lot. So what is care work? Care work is labor involved in looking after the needs of others. Very simple. So teaching has an element of care work. Nursing has an element of care work. Being a doctor, social services, all those have elements of care work within the job. Being an economist, not so much. Being an electrical engineer, not so much, right? Care work is involved in these teacher, nurse, social service type professions. Parenting, elder care, and community and volunteer work are also care work. And if you think about it, these are very important fields of our society, especially in an aging society. We need a lot more elder care, for example, and social and nursing and social work and things like that. 61% of informal, that is not paid, carers are women. So women tend to take on those caring roles. Again, we know it's not biological. We looked over those personality traits. There's clearly not enough biological difference between men and women to make 61% of informal care be the choice of women, right? 71% of personal care workers, healthcare workers, and things like that are women. And for some reason, even though we might think of those nursing and care work as very important, and elementary school teachers and things like very important roles, for some reason, those occupations are paid less than male occupations are. So let's see. Some arguments are about levels of education. Of course, maybe women don't get educated as much. That's actually false as men, but they do get educated differently. So a question in feminist economics is, why are women socialized in a way that makes them choose less lucrative care-based careers, right? And of course, often it's arrived at that sort of binary, culturally defined sex model in those weird societies that defines women as these carers and men as these Homo economicus. A lot of research in that area that's very interesting that you could get into and read about more. Here's another picture that shows something interesting. This is men with no children at home, and this is how much they earn on a scale, right? So men with no children at home with a bachelor's degree tend to earn 90, 84, 86. Don't worry about what these separate categories entail, but they earn more than anyone else, right? Let's just look at these are age ranges, actually. Yeah. Let's just look at, say, the 25 to 30 age range here. For simplicity, that's the light green. Men with no children at home earn to 90, whatever that is. If they have a bachelor's degree on the scale, high school degree, 93. Generally across the board, men with no children at home earn the most. Women with no children at home, presumably the same requirements, but women still with no children at home earn about 10% less than men, right? And women with children at home still earn about 10% less. So this study suggests maybe it's not having children that is the thing that makes women earn less than men. Of course, there are other studies that suggest it is not necessarily having children, but being required socially to take time off from your career to care for children. That often is put on women because they're socialized as nurturers and carers. Therefore, they have a career penalty. Women also choose less lucrative careers because they're socialized to be carers, and they're told that they should be nurses instead of engineers, for example. They're told that they should be elementary school teachers instead of engineers, right? Things like that. So this is just a description. There's a lot of detail. There's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of different ways of measuring things, but feminist economists do that. Now we're going to turn to the second school of thought that we discussed today, that is evolutionary economics.